Hi, everyone. I'm Luke Demboski. I co-chair Debevoise and Plimpton's cybersecurity and data privacy team. My one big thing is to have you think about what you can do now to better position your incident response team during this period of remote work. Perhaps it means going forward with that tabletop, but doing it remotely. Perhaps it means running specific phishing testing for this crisis. Perhaps it means putting additional controls around financial transfers. Perhaps it means additional logging or monitoring that will help you answer questions later when we all return to our offices. Good luck, be safe, and I look forward to connecting with you at the forum.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the last panel with the guest appearance that we arranged of Jason Smolenoff's cat, Artemis. I think that was probably one of the highlights, but I understand it was a terrific panel. This is the first time. This next panel is about business email compromise. We've never done this before where we took a particular type of crime and focused it on one panel. So why did we do it this time? Well, because this has become a serious problem that's growing between ransomware and business email compromise. Those are two of the fastest growing areas of cybercrime. And it's become a real problem for companies big and small. And we also thought that it's a big problem with people working from home, which I'm sure the panel will explain. To moderate this discussion, we have Tony Kim, who is the global co-chair of Orrick's cyber privacy and data innovation practice. Tony Kim is the Bo Jackson of incident response. He's yet another one of our experts who, no matter what the cyber regulatory paradigm, whether it be energy, retail, healthcare, financial, these are beginning to spin off into specialized areas. Tony can take the lead. And he also brings two other very unique perspectives today. First, he serves on Orrick's executive committee, which means like every other business, he's got to deal with his own cybersecurity challenges internally. And second, he also helped build what is called Orrick's Trust Anchor blog. Now, normally I wouldn't really talk about the materials on a law firm's website, but in this situation, it doesn't just put news reports of what's happening. It also has a lot of concrete advice. And I think that's a real pride of the Trust Anchor blog. So I really felt the urge to mention it because it's just terrific. And I think that's what makes Tony perhaps the most influential thought leader we have today. Welcome, Tony. So glad you're here.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Next up is Allison Bender from Wilson Sonsini. Now, she is a first-time panelist at the forum. And before she joined Wilson Sonsini, like a lot of our panelists, she was a very experienced and decorated, in this instance, the Department of Homeland Security was her federal experience. She served as senior cybersecurity attorney in the Office of General Counsel, and she was the primary operational legal counsel for the federal response to the Heartbleed vulnerability, to the USIS Keypoint data breaches, and the healthcare.gov data breach, which were all very, very significant. And now she's on the different side. I just started following her Twitter feed at Allison J. Bender. It's terrific, too. Most of us have made an attempt on Twitter, but then tapered off. Hats off to you, Allison, for getting it going. She's also got 4 big rescue dogs from 60 to 85 pounds. So if one of those hops up during it, we hope you won't get too distracted. Welcome to the IR Forum. We're real excited to have you here, Allison.
Thanks.
Excellent. Our next panelist is Nicole Friedlander. She's also brand new to the IR Forum, but not new at all to the world of IR. She's co-head of the cybersecurity practice at Sullivan and Cromwell. She came to Sullivan from the Southern District of New York, where she served as chief of the complex frauds and cybersecurity unit, cybercrime unit. Her cybersecurity experience includes leading the successful indictment of an Iranian state-sponsored attack on 46 financial institutions and the prosecution of a Russian national for hacking U.S. banks, which the FBI named as one of its top 10 prosecutions of that year. To me, the Southern District of New York prosecutors are a very special group, sort of the elite of the elite. So I'm very excited to hear Nicole's thoughts on business email compromise, which I'm sure she's seen from both sides of the coin. Welcome, Nicole, and I hope you're staying safe and healthy in New York.
Yes, John, thanks. Likewise. Thanks for having me here.
Excellent. And then finally, we have Michael D'Ambrosio, who's Director for Cyber of the Office of Investigations of the United States Secret Service. And we could not be more thrilled with Assistant Director D'Ambrosio, because he's been helping keep us all safe since 1991 when he was a platoon commander in the Marine Corps. He's probably a good person to know when a client calls you about a BEC attack and you have only a short time. We've all been in this situation to stop the money from moving. And this is one of the few areas that you can actually stop the fraud if you get in early enough. But you just have to have the right people, and you have to know the right people, especially given this work from home model. So I'm so grateful that Director D'Ambrosio would take the time to be a part of this group. And I really want to give him a special thank you for helping keep the president and all of us safe during all this. So welcome, Mike. We're real happy to have you.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Tony, then I'm going to leave and go get started on the next panel.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Bruce Carton, of course, our good friend, and all the staff for putting on this great event. It's always one of the favorite conferences that we attend every year. And thank you in advance to my co-panelists. So just to sort of set the agenda, we want to talk today. We only have about 45 minutes with you. Define BEC, what it is, talk quickly about how to respond, and then hit the reset button. Go back and talk about the investigation elements, some investigation dynamics that are unique to BEC, hit compliance and enforcement risk that we face in the BEC context, go around the horn and get some key takeaways from our experts on the panel, and then close the session with some Q&A from you all in the audience. So BEC, I'll never forget several years ago, so this is early days, we had a client intake call, and the client is describing what happened. And I interject, I say, this fact pattern actually sounds like what we would call a BEC attack. Are you familiar with BEC? The client says, no, but the way that you're talking, it sounds like it stands for big effing catastrophe. Is that right? And we had a chuckle and we said, no. And luckily for that client, it was not. But to this day, the client and I have a little bit of an inside joke. Anytime we're experiencing a personal or professional disaster, we refer to it as the BEC. So feel free to use that as part of your everyday speech, but only orally and not in writing so it doesn't get misconstrued. That's a segue to our first point. And maybe I'll go to Nikki. BEC, it could be a big effing catastrophe, but of course it stands for business email compromise. But help level set us a little bit. What are the flavors? What is a BEC? When we say that, what do we mean? Kick that off for us, Nikki, if you don't mind.
Sure. So in a BEC, someone is deceived into making a wire transfer or sending out confidential information in response to what appears to be a legitimate request from someone they work with, but it's actually a request coming from criminals. It's called a business email compromise, but it's not only businesses that are targeted. We have had many cases of BECs involving high net worth individuals are a big target of these, and the representatives and personal assistants who can send money on their behalf. They come in a few different flavors, if you will. The most basic of which is a straight spoofing email. So that can be sent to, for example, someone who works in the finance department. They get an email from what appears to be a vendor or a CEO or a CFO of the company directing that some payment be made to an account for something that seems legitimate. And only on close inspection can you see that the email that the email domain that the email came from is slightly off, usually by a letter. Sometimes the language is not clear. The English isn't great, and so you can sometimes spot the fraudulent email that way. The more insidious BECs, which are unfortunately very common, involve spear phishing attacks that are very targeted at the person they're going after and enable criminals to steal passwords and access the email account of the person they're targeting. So the CEO or the CFO, the vendor in my example. Once they're in, the criminals can read people's emails. They can learn the language and the style of the person whose email account they've compromised. And then they can actually send wire transfer requests from the email account. So there isn't even a fraudulent email account or domain to detect. So these can be very, very difficult to catch before they happen. I guess the last point I would make is that BECs have become increasingly common with businesses that use Office 365. It's a very a favored attack vector for people who perpetrate these schemes. Office 365 has features that make it user friendly. It has features that make it, security settings that by default make it easy to use. But the flip side of that is that it can be easier with Office 365, at least on its default settings, for criminals to steal, to target people and steal their passwords. So that's easily addressed with Office 365 by changing the default security settings, but it's something to keep in mind.
So thanks, Nikki. So spoofing, spear phishing, stuff that we've heard about since the early days of cybercrime. I mean, Mike, give us a sense. Obviously, at Secret Service, you have an interesting sort of perch to view this whole thing. How serious is this? Why is this its own topic at this forum? What are we talking about in terms of magnitude?
Sure. So first, Tony, right? Let's take a look. Business email compromise. What I'll tell you is it's not really a new scam. Right? It's an old scam that what cyber criminals have done is sort of evolved it utilizing technology, right? So as far as this trend goes, it's probably the greatest increasing cyber scam that we have today. It actually accounts for about 40% of what I call all cyber-enabled fraud. So when you consider ransomware, network intrusions, and the other things, BECs right now account for about 40% of that. Who are they targeting? Right. And I think Nikki described it pretty well. We call it business email compromise, but it's really not business, just businesses. Individuals are targeted. Small, medium-sized companies are targeted. Nonprofits, academic institutions are targeted on it as well. I think, as Nikki said, the primary vector is sort of social engineering, right? Something to take into consideration. These really aren't sort of complex zero-day attacks. Right? It's going after doing a reconnaissance. It may be a network intrusion where they hack into an email account and do some reconnaissance internally in your network. Or it may just be, I know something about your network and we just broadcast regular types of frauds, right? The FBI Internet Crimes Complaint Center in 2019 received 467,000 cybercrime complaints for $3.5 billion in losses, right? For BECs, about 24,000 of those were BEC victims, accounting for about 1.7 billion. So essentially, almost half of that, right? 883% increase in instances of BECs, and about a 685% increase in losses. 26 billion in the last 3 years, and we kind of think that's only about 15% of these things are reported. Right. So when you look at those numbers, you can tell this is a very serious crime. It's really sort of low-hanging fruit for criminals to go after these BECs. And that's why we're seeing this significant increase.
So that's fantastic insight, Mike. And I know that in all of our practices, we just continue to see these types of fact patterns come up, whether you're in the government or in private practice or in-house. And I was reading because I wanted to know what the last sort of huge one was. And I thought I'd have to look a couple of years ago, but I saw, just at the end of November 2019 last year, Nikkei America, which, as many of you know, is a subsidiary of a global Japanese media conglomerate, reported that an employee transferred 3.2 billion yen. That's about $30 million based on fraudulent instructions to a malicious third party based in Hong Kong. And that's literally a couple months ago. And so this just continues to happen, even though, as you said, Mike, it's not a terribly sophisticated sort of vector on the front end, and as Nikki alluded to. Okay, switching gears. What most and many in-house counsel, of course, and internal stakeholders want to know, if this happens, Allison, if you have a BEC attack or compromise, does anybody externally have to know? Is this a reportable, a notifiable event? Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks so much. Of course, each incident is going to be highly fact dependent. It may involve the amount that's been fraudulently transferred. It may involve access to other information that was contained within those email inboxes. But certainly considerations that businesses should be having front of mind when this type of incident may be discovered would be data breach notifications under state laws or internationally in other jurisdictions, for example, the UK and the European Union under the GDPR. FinCEN reporting and then SEC reporting to the extent that the entity is regulated, such as a publicly traded company. State data breach notification laws are going to trigger based on generally unauthorized access and acquisition of defined categories of personal information. Of course, the best way to protect against that kind of exposure is to limit the amount of email you retain and also to take additional precautions against things like having that one spreadsheet with 40,000 social security numbers in it, which somehow always happens. There's always an example like that. FinCEN reporting is also something to be considered. Certainly, guidance has been given over the years from 2016 with advisory notices to more recently in 2019 when Treasury really wanted to stress to people that this was a major issue that many businesses were facing. Financial institutions are required to file a suspicious activity report if it knows, suspects, or has reasons to suspect that a transaction that has been conducted or attempted by or through the financial institution is involving some illegal activity. So certainly if you're crossing the threshold for that suspicious activity, something to be considered. FinCEN is also a great contact regardless because they can, in some cases, help you track down the funds. You're going to want to try to get to the bank before your wire is all the way to mainland China or wherever it may be headed. But FinCEN can also be a help. The third disclosure obligation that I mentioned briefly at the beginning was the possibility of SEC filings and seeing the rise in this type of attack over the years. The SEC in October of 2018 put out guidance and an investigative report focusing on the obligations that are imposed by Section 13B2B 1 and 3 to devise and maintain internal accounting controls to reasonably safeguard the company and ultimately investor assets from cyber-related fraud. None of the companies that were investigated ended up being charged in that instance, but it really adds emphasis that public companies need to ensure that any executed transactions occur with the authorization of management and maintaining those internal controls, ideally not just an email to send out a massive wire transfer, are going to be part of what those reasonable safeguards look like. Those are really the three main areas for disclosure obligations that I would be initially looking at for any client that raised this sort of business email compromise. But those key issues may vary depending on what sector a particular client is in, and then also looking at contractual and insurance notifications that may be required as well.
All right, that's super helpful. We're going to turn back, Allison, to you in a moment when we hit reset and come back to how we actually investigate and what are we doing kind of in the forensic investigation. Just a quick sort of note, because I want to come to Mike for a second about law enforcement. But, before I do that, a quick sort of anecdote. My dad has a small business. He's a small business owner in Eugene, Oregon. He's in the automotive repair business. He actually collects and processes a fair amount of data, right, about his customers, payment card data, et cetera. I, a couple of years ago, actually suggested to him that, I do cyber stuff, and how about I put together like a little incident response plan for you? He said, no, I have a plan. It's got one step in it. I said, oh, okay, I want to hear what the one step is. And he goes, yeah, if anything ever happens, I'll call the cops. And I said, anything else? And he said, nope, just call the cops. And I said, that's not a bad way to start. Mike, in this instance, do you call the cops? What can law enforcement actually do to help? Is that a sound strategy?
So listen, absolutely. I think sometimes the best is to go to the older generation. I think sometimes they've got it sort of licked and have the best answers. And so, yeah,
Don't you stick up for my dad, Mike. You just don't need that on the
Listen, I could put him at a couple of our incident response forums because that's what we try and tell people. Listen, right, especially with business email compromises, okay? The sooner you can call law enforcement, the sooner you can, the most successful we are in getting your money back. I will tell you that within 24 to 72 hours, law enforcement in general is pretty successful in recovering money, right? A lot of times the problem is people go through their sort of processes and it takes them a while to get to the point where they call law enforcement and the money has really either left the U.S. or the criminals have taken it out of ATMs and turned it into cash and the money is gone. Listen, here's what we say in law enforcement, right? Criminal justice theory talks about three things in order for a crime to happen. One, you have to have a vulnerable victim, okay? You have to have a motivated offender, and you have to be in an environment that sort of facilitates crime. So let's talk a little bit about the victim here and what law enforcement can do to address it, right? Go back to sort of the 70s where you had this community-oriented policing, and it's sort of evolved into today smart policing. It's preventative and awareness. We talked a little bit, Tony, how we said this is not a sophisticated crime, right? So just by letting people know that it's out there and educating their staff, they can put in place processes that will prevent a lot of business email compromises, right? Multi-factor authentication, whether it be into your email system or whether it even be just in the process of transfers, put in place a process where when there's a transfer, multiple people are being asked questions. These bad guys, they're pretty smart. They actually do a lot of work. If they just became honest, they'd probably be great in the private and public sector, right? But they know when the CEO travels. And so they send a transfer order when the CEO is sort of out of communication, right? And so putting in processes that can stop that is extremely very effective. Then comes the mitigation if it does occur, right? One, as soon as you know it occurs, call your bank, reverse the transfer, call law enforcement. Law enforcement will call FinCEN, enact the financial kill chain, and try and get that money back. There's two ways that law enforcement goes after these business email compromise schemes. One of them is we call sort of a cyber approach, right? Where there is a digital signature to these attacks. We want the IPs. We want those emails, those phishing emails, so that we can go after and follow sort of your digital signature, right? In the old days, we would go after and follow the link analysis on phone numbers. Today, it's really IPs and those types of things, right?
Hey, Mike, let me just jump in really quick with a couple of questions coming in from the audience. When we say law enforcement, who do we mean? Do we mean calling the FBI, or do we mean calling Secret Service, who, as you know very well, has a special unit and task force sort of set up for BEC? When we say law enforcement, who are you specifically referring to? Many people want to know.
So real quick, right? I think both the Secret Service and the FBI have cyber fraud task forces, and so to you, Father, I would recommend have you called both your local FBI field office and your local Secret Service field office. Both of the groups within the FBI and the Secret Service, they're also partnered with local law enforcement, right? So by calling one of those task forces, you really accomplish all of the objectives. And I will tell you, the Bureau and the Secret Service, we're essentially building a program where we're exchanging agents. And so for the public sector, call whoever you have the relationship with. If you have it with the FBI, for whatever reason, you met him at a forum and you have a great relationship with him, call the FBI. If you have a great relationship with your Secret Service, call the Secret Service. The key is don't wait to do that. To the law firms that are out there that are running these incident response tabletop exercises, right? And you talk about law enforcement's role in the preparation phase, make sure law enforcement is invited and you build that relationship ahead of time. Because here's the key. Usually, a lot of times, if you call somebody and you have a hard time getting a hold of somebody, well, that's time that's wasted. You know somebody and you call, they're going to act very, very quickly. We had a call with business executives, National Security Forum, knew somebody here. They called us. We were able to recover about $100,000 in their of a transfer almost immediately just because they knew somebody. So I can't emphasize enough that, Tony.
So, Nikki, Allison, who do you call? I mean, I know who I call. I call a guy that actually works directly for Mike, and that's sort of the first point of contact for me. But you guys, there's a bunch of audience questions about who literally do you contact. I think I have a suspicion that people are going to start asking Mike D'Ambrosio for his cell phone number. But apart from that, is there anybody else? Who do you guys like to contact for stuff like this?
In addition to the Secret Service, the FBI, my local field office is the New York office. You know, we know a bunch of agents there, but you can just call the office. You should also file an online complaint with the FBI at ic3.gov. That's their Internet Crime Complaint Center. It's important to do.
Yep. Allison, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, we also try and include whoever the local field office is for wherever our client is located. So if they're in San Francisco, we'll call the San Francisco field office. If they're in Austin, we'll call the Austin field office. And that can be really helpful as well.
Okay, fantastic.
I would the FBI, usually they like to emphasize the importance of filing that online crime complaint. That triggers, they have people staff that 24 hours a day, and it triggers an immediate notification to an on-duty agent who can get the kill chain process that Mike described underway.
Interesting. Excellent. Nikki, Mike touched on this. If you catch a BEC sort of in flight, you contact your financial institution, what can and will they do, and how quickly? What's some of the advice there? We're getting comments from the audience about that as well. Can they do anything for you? Can they help you? What will they do?
They will. Banks play a hugely important role in responding to BECs. As Mike mentioned, the bank can process a wire recall. That can be the fastest and easiest way to secure the money or get your money back. Tony, if your dad's going to add one more point to his incident response plan, if there are going to be 2 steps, the step number 2 should be call the bank. It can be the difference between getting your money back and not getting any of it back. Even if the money, if the bank can't process the wire recall, even if the money's gone out and can't be recalled, which is often the case because it can only be recalled if it's detected very, very quickly. The bank's call to the receiving bank can trigger a freeze at the receiving bank. The receiving banks are often willing to voluntarily restrain the funds on a call like that from your sending bank. The receiving bank may need a hold harmless letter or a call from local law enforcement or something like that, but that's not a big deal, and they can freeze the funds right as soon as they get that call from your bank. So very important call to make. I would just add, in terms of responding to these, that the receiving bank can restrain the funds, but they usually can't just hand them back to you. So just a note on Hong Kong in particular, which is the first hop for a lot of these schemes. It's the first place that the money tends to go. In Hong Kong, by law, the bank cannot return the money just because federal law enforcement asks them to, or the victim asks them to. You have to go through an established court process there. It's a civil litigation, but it's non-adversarial. It's really quite basic and simple. It takes some weeks or a few months to get your money back, and you just need local counsel in Hong Kong to help you file that action. But you should get local counsel involved to start getting that process underway in Hong Kong.
Excellent. And just to add to that, it's one of the takeaways that we'll get to in a little while, but, the UCC actually governs liability as between financial institutions and clients with respect to wire transfers, and many agreements that our clients had with their financial institutions like to detail the procedures that you have to follow in authorizing or authenticating wire transfers. And it does provide a mechanism for the bank to potentially pass liability onto the client. For some of these instances. So that's something also in your interaction with your financial institutions to take a look. Mike, anything to add just on this point before we hit rewind and talk a little bit about the forensic investigation?
No, I think the group covered. I think Nikki really, when she talks about the Hong Kong, that is primarily the first hop. I think the key to understand is that most of these have an international connection. Even though the bad guys have sort of learned they need a hop within the U.S. because sending money for a wire transfer overseas sort of triggers some flags, right? That initial hop in the U.S., it moves very, very quickly. So it just goes to the point that you really have to have processes in place and try and identify it as quickly as possible and get with law enforcement and your bank to try and recover your money.
Okay. Let us hit rewind, Allison. client says, company says, I think we had a fraudulent wire transfer go out. What do we do? Like, what are we looking for in the forensic investigation? You get Jason Smolenoff and his cat to come in and do some investigative work. What are we looking at? Are we just going to start looking at every single email to see, going back to your prior point, if there was personal information involved that triggers? I mean, it sounds like it turns into a massive e-discovery project. Is that how these go? Can they go that way? Is this really the big effing catastrophe, or is something more targeted that can be done?
Well, sometimes it can be, and part of that depends on the nature of the attack itself. If it was a simple phishing attempt resulting in the redirection of funds, your network might not have been, compromised at all. If they're reading your emails, if they have access to your VoIP, teleconference, and desk phones, and they're able to listen into your calls, they probably know when you send the email, oh goodness, we've been compromised, or why didn't so-and-so receive their payment, or why did you wire 3.1 million to China after borrowing it on our line of credit? All of these sorts of things come up, and that can be one basis for the scope of the investigation. Another thing to consider is how you're protecting that kind of data. If you have log data that shows that there wasn't lateral movement of the actor, or that these emails haven't been accessed, or they didn't also access OneDrive, that can narrow the scope of your investigation. For companies that know that they're likely to face a public disclosure and they don't have log data, that can be a more painful forensic process. And it does have the potential to turn into a little bit of an e-discovery process. There are certainly ways of approaching that with pattern matching recognition, and also being able to exclude files that had additional encryption or that were only based on a cloud service that hasn't been compromised. But the best way to prevent an incident from turning into a massive e-discovery project is to put your preparation in on the front. And certainly we can help clients navigate, how far do I have to go for this to be a reasonable investigation.
Excellent. Nikki and then Mike, just really quickly, a bunch of questions coming in. If the victim is not in the U.S., a European or Asian subsidiary, or just a company based in those jurisdictions, maybe just quickly, Mike, law enforcement, same sort of drill? Do you call law enforcement? And then Nikki, anything special if you're, for example, a European company or based in Europe and you're dealing with these issues? So maybe Mike just first and then Nikki.
So, listen, we have the Secret Service and both the FBI, we have people overseas. It does become a jurisdiction issue, right? And so you have to have some sort of violation of U.S. law and a nexus to a U.S. bank and those types of things, right? If you were to call U.S. law enforcement. But generally speaking, we would say call your local law enforcement within a particular country. I will tell you that we have very close ties with Europol, right? And so we have individuals that sit together at Europol so that when these schemes come together, right, if they're targeting somebody in Europe, they're probably targeting somebody in the U.S. And a lot of times we'll end up with a larger investigation. I'll tell you, you could look on an open source case was Operation Wire, in which the Bureau, it was actually a multi-agency case. 74 individuals were arrested sort of internationally. The service had about 24 of these individuals. 10 million in actual loss, 5 million recovered, right? And a lot of that is working with our international counterparts. I can tell you for the service, National Crime Agency sits within our offices. We work very closely with the NCFTA, where our foreign law enforcement counterparts are, as well as, like I said, Europol. And so, again, I think it goes back to your dad, call the police. If you call the police, it will generally move you in the right direction quickly.
Okay. Nikki, anything more on this? And then I want to talk.
I agree with what Mike said. I think calling the bank wherever you're located and really raising an alarm so that they act right away is crucial. Informing law enforcement in the country where the victim is located is crucial. I agree with Mike. I would still inform federal law enforcement here. They may not investigate. It may not have any U.S. touch points. It may not be worth their while, given how many of these they have to deal with, to investigate. But it can only be helpful. It doesn't hurt. And frankly, it can be helpful in just building a record that you responded appropriately. So even if you just think about it as kind of a CYA matter, it takes only minutes to do. And there's only upside to it.
Great. All right. 5 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A. 5 minutes on takeaways, how to prepare. And I think you guys have embedded tips and pointers along the way, which is fantastic. But let's just go around the horn and maybe start with Allison. If you had one takeaway, what would it be to prepare on the front end, as you said, to make sure that if we have a situation like this, that we at least can address it, maybe nip it in the bud, maybe respond quickly. The one takeaway that you would have.
It's hard to pick just one. Preparation generally. But I think particularly when it comes to business email compromise, having the controls in place regarding your financial systems, your authorizations for wire transfers, and making sure that the employees that have those responsibilities are very well trained and can spot these types of issues to the best anyone can, really can help you avoid some of these types of issues.
Mike.
Yes, sir. So for me, I agree with Allison. What I'm going to say is it's that community-oriented policing approach, training, education, and awareness. Most of these crimes are not sophisticated. So the more that you can educate those individuals within your organization, I think the more successful you're going to be, right? One of the key things is don't overshare information. Everybody likes to put things out on social media, right? Well, again, these bad guys, they put together what they learned from your organization when they do their recon and your social media. So they may put in an email that says, hey, wire $80,000. I'll be at my kid's soccer game. And if that makes sense in the email, you're more likely to believe it. I'm kind of a Luddite. I don't have a social media presence. That's probably a little bit on the one side, but I would be very, very careful of what you share on social media as an executive and those types of things. So,
excellent. Nikki, words of wisdom.
Two-factor authentication. I think it's the easiest thing to do that can nip a lot of these in the bud. So many of these happen because the bad guys dupe someone into handing over their username and password. And with two-factor authentication, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, for them to get into the email account, even if they have that. So,
fantastic. I think that the multi-factor authentication, again, an old school control that applies in so many contexts, and here, particularly with what you noted about the O365 environment, is just critical. And then even just for plain old wire transfers that happen, having either a phone, oral, or other type of verification with your financial institution before wiring, having two-factor in the sense that if a vendor address or payment account number changes, having a double sort of check or double authorization can go a long way. I would just add to all of this, many of the things that we're talking about in terms of investigating and actually getting to the bottom of what happened is made more difficult because sometimes clients actually don't have logging. And I see some of the questions coming in about what if you don't have logging, then how do you even go about this? There are other, of course, forensic techniques with respect to even if you don't have logging in the O365 context, for example, in the unified audit logs into the actual sort of step-by-step what everything that happened. There are other forensic methodologies, right? Like checking the search items tool in the Outlook menu to see what if the attacker actually looked for stuff like payments and wire transfer, et cetera, which we see often. And there are many, many other techniques I think that you can bring to bear. But training, education, et cetera, of course, really, really critical. So let me see if there's, first of all, if any of the panelists have anything more to add? And if not, I think I'll add or ask you guys just one or two more questions from the group. But anything, Mike or Allison or Nikki, that you really wanted to say that we didn't prompt during the outline? Now's your chance.
Would love to hear some questions from the audience.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I thought was sort of interesting is, what percentage or how often is the BEC compromise or the BEC attack happening just by spoof? And maybe this is a question for you, Nikki, meaning someone just sends a fake email versus someone's actually in your system doing reconnaissance and then, directing traffic, because obviously the latter is much scarier. And we've had a bunch of questions about how does that sort of shake out? And I think they're asking, Nikki, because they want to I think folks want a game plan. What should we be looking at right now, to kind of set our controls? In your experience, how does that sort of shake out?
Look, it's just anecdotal, but I think there's a ton of both. So you have to be thinking about both. The straight spoof is so easy to do. It costs, there's no investment of time or money. There are zillions of them all day long. They have a lower success rate, I would think. I mean, again, it's just anecdotal. But there's a lot of targeted spear phishing that goes on too. I mean, as Mike said, people, particularly if they're in the private sector, if they're executives, if they're wealthy, they have, these social media presences they're trying to build up all the time. And the downside of that is that there are people all the time trying to target them for that reason. People who work in the finance department get targeted. Anyone who can be, if you can figure out on the internet that the person can authorize a wire transfer, they're being targeted.
Excellent. So, Mike, question for you. If somebody calls you and says, we had a BEC, incident, can you help us? Is there actually a threshold amount? Will you say, what are we talking about before you actually engage? Or are you open for business, Mike?
So we are open for business. For us, the way we look at it with BECs is that Secret Service has a much narrower focus than the Bureau, right? We only focus on cyber-enabled sort of financial fraud. The Bureau's portfolio is just much bigger. And so we will try and get the money back. We will try and look for connections to other cases, because your little BEC, maybe it's only 20,000, but that mule account that it goes to may be connected to several other cases, and we may tie it back to another case. If we get your money back, great. And listen, there are prosecution type of levels that we'll bring it to, depending on the AUSA's office, and that really is district dependent. And so I would argue is this. I think what Nikki said, follow this process. Call your bank, reverse it, call law enforcement, and report it to the IC3. All three of those things, if you make that part of your BEC playbook, that would be a good plan for you. Great.
Thank you so much, Mike. Allison, a question actually that came in for you was, just touch on a little bit more of when the attackers get into the system, just how clever they are in kind of hiding their tracks, right? Like setting up rules to like redirect emails and just touch on that a little bit to give people sort of the information around. These are not always obvious until they're obvious, right?
Sure. There's certainly a range of sophistication amongst different actors. You may find that an earlier data breach that resulted in the loss of your, for example, investor relations spreadsheet or your vendor list, your active invoice list, had been compromised, and then all of a sudden you find that payments are missing. That's one of the easier ones, I think, to figure out. But if an adversary is in your system, auto forwarding, auto deletion, those are email rules that we recommend as a preparatory step that companies disable, because that is a common move for these types of attackers. More on the even more sophisticated end of things are going to be manipulation and obfuscation in the actual log data. And that's going to be a very skilled threat actor, where really forensics are going to be important to make sure that when you expel them from the system, they're really out.
Yep, exactly. And, you want to, certainly when you have the forensics folks in, you want to ask, Small Enough's CAT to look at places For example, folders that aren't often checked, right? We've seen a lot of rules created to forward to RSS feeds and et cetera. Okay, I see Bruce Carton coming online. I can't thank this panel enough. I have so much information now to share with my dad to really buff up his incident response program at his shop. I'm confident that he'll listen to me. Thank you on behalf of everybody, to the audience, for sending in such great questions. And over to you, Bruce.
Tony, thanks so much. I still can't believe you don't have your own talk show yet, but I am sure that that's in the works. Just a reminder, there are a lot of amazing questions and information being passed in the chat function. I had no idea this was going to be such a hit, the chat part. But the reminder is, if you have a question that you want the panel to answer, make sure you put it in the questions box so it goes directly to them. The next panel begins at 11 a.m. Very interesting panel called Managing the Insider Threat in the World of Cyber. So we will see you in 5 minutes. Thank you.